The mysteries and wonder of ancient Egypt still fascinate and intrigue us thousands of years later. Egyptologists continue on their quest to unravel the last surviving secrets of this complex civilization. In many respects, it's as though time has stood still. The banks of the Nile continue to preserve a way of life from thousands of years before. We now have a detailed picture of a people who dominated the Eastern Mediterranean while Europe was just beginning to develop into a complex society. This ancient civilization was the first great nation state. Egypt has left a legacy which has survived into the 20th century. We now have an accurate picture of the ancient Egyptians from their massive stone monuments, which have stood the ravages of time. The Egyptians were master builders. They created solid structures which were able to stand thousands of years of vandalism, pillaging, and intense desert heat. Luckily, it was this dry, arid heat which helped to preserve so much of Egypt's glorious past. The modern world is fortunate to have vast collections of Egyptian artifacts in museums all over the world. Egyptian artisans and craftsmen were extremely prolific, and the quality of their work has enabled it to bear testament of such an advanced civilization. Egyptian chronology is set with the beginning of the early dynastic period, beginning at 3200 BC. Eventually, Egypt's place of power shifted, and it became overshadowed by the Western world. It became absorbed at first by Persia during the 21st dynastic period from 341 BC to 332 BC, and then by the Macedonians from 332 BC to 304 BC, and Romans and Byzantines from 30 BC to 640 AD. Egypt in all its splendor continues to influence the modern world in various ways, such as architecture and design. People are still fascinated by the ancient Egyptian civilization and search new avenues to try to solve the mysteries of times long ago. We continue to admire and be captivated by Egypt's greatness. When visiting Egypt today, we experience the vitality and beauty of its country and its people. Egypt is the land bridge which crosses Asia and Africa. It covers approximately 387,000 miles, but only about 15,000 of it is usable. The Nile is the lifeline for Egypt. It flows northward through Egypt and is parallel with the coast of the Red Sea. It provides the backdrop for the complex civilization of Egypt and is considered one of the great rivers of the world. The Nile not only comprised the geographical lines, but also the cultural lines as well. Egypt was originally comprised of two parts, Upper and Lower Egypt. The delta was referred to as Lower Egypt, and the valley between what is today Cairo and Aswan was known as Upper Egypt. Today, Egyptians still cling to this lifeline, with over 95% of its inhabitants living on the area near the banks of the Nile. This narrow valley has all the cultivable land for the country. This area is slightly larger than the state of Maryland, being less than 15,000 square miles. The banks of the Nile flood every year, which provides the delta with a rich soil for planting. The oldest dam was built near Helwan between 2950 and 2750 BC. Every year, the inundation of the Nile provides the soil with additional nutrients so that the crops can be planted yearly without the worry of depleting the soil. As we trace the history of this lost civilization, we understand the importance of the Nile and how it is reflected in all aspects of Egyptian life. We have information which leads us to believe that around 12,000 BC, Egyptians were already harvesting crops and domesticating animals. The pre-dynastic period began around 4000 BC, and it was during this period that two kingdoms appeared around 3500 BC, one in Lower and the other in Upper Egypt. The Narmer palette, which depicts King Narmer as the king of the northern kingdom, is the first complete piece of Egyptian art. The early dynastic period began around 3200 BC. The first dynasty was formed by King Themis, and the pharaonic line began. There were now trade lines established with Mesopotamia, and there was the beginning of a crafts and industrial movement. We have evidence of the use of hieroglyphics during this time. There are elaborate business records as well as the introduction of a lunar calendar. Mathematical and astronomical foundations were established during this time, which provided them with sound strategies for the beginning of the massive building projects of Egypt. The Old Kingdom began with the Third Dynasty around 2780 BC. This was a time of transition for Egypt because it had emerged into a nation. King Zoser was the first pharaoh to delegate his full authority to his prime minister or vizier. Imhotep was a priest, magician, poet, architect, and physician. His official title was Chief of all Works of the King. His most famous accomplishment was the step pyramid at Saqqara. This pyramid is considered the first Egyptian monument. By early standards, it was considered quite large, measuring 990 feet wide and 1,785 feet long. The Fourth Dynasty was extremely prolific and a creative time for Egypt. We have exquisite examples of Egyptian wall reliefs of Egyptian art. The most famous accomplishment of this period was the building of the Great Pyramids for Cheops, Sephron, and Mycerinus. The first record that we have recording the dynasties of the rulers of Egypt comes from Menthro, an Egyptian priest who lived during the time of the reign of Ptolemy I, approximately 300 BC. He identified 30 dynasties or royal families. His dates were not very accurate, but it provides us with a skeletal outline to work with. As in many civilizations, Egypt began as tribes that evolved into two kingdoms, one that ruled up to the delta, and a second that ruled the entire delta area. In the delta, man used the available resources and quickly advanced. A 365-day calendar year was utilized in 4241 BC. The two lands, as it was referred to, was united under the rule of Menes around 3400 BC. It is the royal house that begins the identification of the dynasties. Menes and his descendants ruled Egypt for about 4 centuries, leading the country and establishing a strong socio-economic society. This was identified as the Old Kingdom. The family ruled from Memphis, near the banks of the Nile. It stayed the seat of government from the 3rd to 6th dynasty, a time span of over 500 years, 2,980 to 2,475 BC. It was during the 4th dynasty that the Great Pyramid at Giza was built by Cheops, also known as Khufu. It covers 13 acres and is made up of more than 2 million blocks of stone, each weighing about 2.5 tons. The entire pyramid is made of limestone. Cheops had convinced his followers that the king needed a burial place that was not only a monument, but also indestructible. It took 100,000 laborers to build the pyramid, and scholars today are not in agreement as to how the pyramid was constructed. The pyramid is about 481 feet high, and its square base measured approximately 755 feet on each side. Complicated passageways were built in the pyramid to confuse tomb robbers of the location of the pharaoh's resting place. We still have no clear understanding as to how the sarcophagus reached the inner burial chamber. All the government's energy and focus was directed toward the building of the pyramid. The Great Sphinx and the second pyramid were built at Giza by Cheops' son, Chephren. The second pyramid is smaller in size. The interior of the pyramid is of polished red granite and translucent alabaster. The workmanship is not as accomplished as in the Great Pyramid. The Sphinx stands near the entrance to the second pyramid. It has been determined that it is modeled after a pharaoh, but we are unsure as to whether it is a portrait of Chephren or not. The body of a lion symbolizes the pharaoh's power. The Sphinx lost its nose because when Napoleon's men were in Egypt thousands of years later, they used the Sphinx as target practice. The third pyramid at Giza was built by Khafre's successor, Menkaure. If we are to judge the size of a pyramid to the power of its builder, we would see that Menkaure's power has certainly diminished from the days of Cheops and the Great Pyramid. It was difficult to come up with the workforce needed for such a vast undertaking, and the natural resources from the quarries were beginning to be depleted. This pyramid is less than half as high as the other two pyramids and was faced with sunbrick instead of granite. Menkaure died before the pyramid was completed. These are the only pyramids at Giza that have withstood thousands of years. There is some evidence pointing to a fourth pyramid, but there is no physical evidence to support this theory. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the royal seat of power had weakened considerably. King Pepi I, with his son Menkaure, who was his co-regent, conducted 5 military campaigns. Menkaure's 6-year-old son Pepi II became pharaoh, and he ruled for 94 years. With his death, there were great internal problems, and the first intermediate period, from 2258 BC to 2052 BC, was a continuous stream of disputes and altercations. The royal seat had been moved to Thebes. It wasn't until about 2052 that the country was reunited and peaceful, and the Middle Kingdom began. This established the foundation for the feudal state. Egypt had the workforce to take on large building and irrigational projects. Thousands of people were exploited by royal decree to work in the gold mines. Egypt had diplomatic ties with Syria and traveled to the northern Mediterranean. Egypt had finally established itself as a dominant power. The endless supply of gold from the mines provided the pharaohs with an incredible treasury to enable the royalty to pursue endless indulgences of self-glorification in the building of monuments and self-indulgences of jewelry and elaborate furnishings. Its well-entrenched agricultural production provided this ancient civilization with the necessary resources to expand in all areas. Literature flourished during this time. The monuments that had begun to be built carried detailed inscriptions of the pharaoh's accomplishments and personal philosophies. After the 12th dynasty, Egypt entered into a second intermediate period from 1786 to 1570 BC. Once again, Egypt began to experience internal problems. It left itself extremely vulnerable to any invasion by foreigners. The Hyksos easily won its way into the delta. It wasn't until the beginning of the new kingdom with the 18th dynasty that the Hyksos were driven out of Egypt by Ahmose I. We have a record from the tomb of Ahmose which tells of his victory. I speak to you all mankind, that I may let you know the favors which have come to me. I have been awarded gold 7 times in the presence of the entire land, and male and female slaves in like manner, and I have been vested with many fields. The reputation of a valiant man is from what he has done, not being destroyed in this land forever. Egypt was now a significant military power. Ahmose's campaigns had expanded Egypt's borders to include south of the Second Cataract to Palestine. It also experienced a great deal of affluence. His son, Amenhotep I, was considered one of Egypt's greatest military leaders. He led various military campaigns which enabled the Egyptians to regain territory that had been lost during the Second Intermediate Period. Because of this new level of international diplomacy, we have many records of the king and vizier accounts of returning to power and accounting ledgers which recorded their deposits into their treasury. It is during this dynasty that we see the pharaohs being buried in the Valley of the Kings. Valley of the Kings is comprised of 62 tombs carved in the cliffs of a valley behind Deir el-Bahri. The valley is broken down into 2 areas: the East Valley, where most of the tombs are located, and the West Valley, which has the tombs of 2 pharaohs. The tombs that have been discovered span from the 18th to the 20th dynasties. The first tomb was that of Thutmose I, and the last is that of Ramses XI. Most of the tombs were designed with a long corridor with at least one hall which led to the burial chamber. These tombs were decorated with scenes of the kings in the presence of the gods. There are numerous inscriptions from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Although many of these tombs have been vandalized and endured the wrath of time, it is not difficult to imagine these tombs when they were nearly completed to accommodate their royal inhabitants. Thutmose I, the next pharaoh, assumed the throne and expanded the Egyptian boundaries even further. He went as far as the Euphrates in the north and near the 4th cataract in the Nile in the south. He was followed by his daughter, Hatshepsut. She ruled for 20 years. She initially went to public functions dressed as a king so as to conceal that she was a woman. She eventually stopped using disguises, but after her death, almost all monuments and portraits of her were defaced. More than likely, her male subordinates resented being ruled by a woman. Another strong ruler of the new kingdom was Thutmose III. He led many successful military campaigns and was able to conquer territory in Lebanon, Mesopotamia, and Syria. The annals of Thutmose III are carved on the walls of the Temple of Karnak in recognition of the fact that the god Amun-Re had given victory. His Majesty commanded that the victories which his father Amun had given to him should be established upon a monument in the temple which his Majesty had made for his father Amun in order to set down each individual campaign, together with the booty which his Majesty carried off from it, and the dues of every foreign country which his father Re had given to him. His grandson, Amenophis III, is primarily known for building a palace and a funerary temple at Thebes. His son, Amenophis IV, who ruled from 1353 to 1335 BC, was one of the most volatile figures in Egyptian history. Being physically frail, he directed his energies to intellectual ideas instead of military campaigns. He proclaimed that Aten, the sun disk, would be the only god to be worshipped. He changed his name to Akhenaten, which meant horizon of Aten. He moved the capital to Middle Egypt and built the city Tel El Armana. Under Akhenaten, Egypt experienced a cultural and religious revolution. He attempted to destroy the religious foundation that had been embedded in the Egyptian way of life. Akhenaten's religious fanaticism is connected with the introduction of monotheism. El Armana was abandoned about 15 years after his short reign. Unfortunately, little has survived of Akhenaten's residence. Stone building blocks were removed to build other sites. We are fortunate to have some beautiful examples of art, such as the statue of Akhenaten's wife, Queen Nefertiti, and the sculpture of a female body, also considered to be that of Nefertiti. It wasn't until the 19th dynasty, from 1320 to 1200 BC, that Egypt returned to an even keel. The 19th and 20th dynasties are known as the Age of Ramesses. Ramses II is also known as Ramses the Great. Under his supervision, there was a vast building campaign to glorify his reign. He built the temple at Abu Simbel and the Great Hall at Karnak. It is during his reign and that of his son Ramses III that a full-time army was established. It was during the 21st dynasty that Egypt began its downward spiral. From 1085 BC to Alexander the Great conquering of Egypt in 332 BC is generally looked upon as the beginning of its loss as an international power. Egypt was in great turmoil for many years. Alexander formed a new capital in Egypt, Alexandria. He died on one of his military campaigns and was returned to Alexandria for burial. The city had an excellent reputation for supporting intellectual thought. It was known throughout the ancient world for its library and university, along with the Pharaoh's Lighthouse, which is considered one of the 7 wonders. The Ptolemies were one of the last group to govern ancient Egypt. Its most famous monarch was Cleopatra VII. We remember her for her romantic entanglements with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. In 30 BC, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. Egyptians were fascinated by aspects of Egyptian religion, and cults of Isis and Osiris spread throughout the empire. When Christianity became the official religion of the empire, Egyptian temples were forced to close. For the following 6 centuries, Egypt found itself under Roman and Byzantine rule. During the 7th century, Egypt was invaded by the Arabs and became the center of Islamic civilization. However, there still remained a Christian community, and it developed its own language, Coptic, which was derived from both Greek and ancient Egyptian. Sadly, this was the last connection with their ancient beginnings. Egypt's days of ancient glory were over. The ancient Egyptians had a deep sense of appreciation for written language. As their civilization flourished, there was a great need to develop a record-keeping system to allow them to keep track of their business transactions. Egypt, by this time, had a sophisticated currency system. They had begun trading in gold and silver in addition to agricultural commodities. Many businesses kept ledgers for their business records. Wills and deeds were used, and binding contracts were honored for many generations. Every nobleman had an entourage of scribes, clerks, and accountants to oversee all his business matters. If someone were to advance in the military, it was required that they be able to read and write. Schools were established which emphasized writing in all aspects of everyday life. The pursuit of knowledge created the beginnings of the middle class, those individuals who were educated and had the opportunity to move up the social ladder. They developed a phonetic language which was depicted by a complicated hieroglyphic writing system which enabled them to record historical events, pay homage to the gods, keep track of their revenues, and write poetry for their loved ones. Hieroglyphics were written and read from right to left, and then from left to right in regular columns or backwards. They used papyrus and ink, which was an easy way to send communications throughout the ancient world. Because of the complexity of the writing, a type of shorthand was developed called hieratic, which was more in the cursive style. The Egyptians were the first to use writing and literature as a form of entertainment. They used 3 styles of writing in their literature: poetry, prose, and a style that was the combination of the other 2 styles. They wrote folk tales, historic tales which told of events of past dynasties, religious writings which explained, for example, the creation of man. Many examples of poetry have remained, including this beautiful love poem, which comes from an inscription from a vase that was found in 1897. My sister has come, my heart exults. my arms spread out to embrace her. My heart bounds in its place, like the red fish in its pond. O night, be mine forever, now that my queen has come. There are many examples of instructions on moral conduct that were written as a model of behavior throughout the Egyptian history. An example of this comes from the Old Kingdom. Know your helpers, then you prosper. Don't be mean towards your friends. They are one's watered field, and greater than one's riches. For what belongs to one belongs to another. The character of a son of man is profit to him. Good nature is a memorial.